Tonight on KQED Newsroom, showdown over the government shutdown. The stalemate over a border wall continues after President Trump addressed the nation this week. Also, we'll look at Governor Gavin Newsom's plan to tackle big issues from health care to natural disasters and the challenges he faces. Plus, Fleeing Shanghai, a new book examines the forgotten exodus out of China, a story with similarities to what's happening around the world today. Hello and welcome to KQED Newsroom. I'm Thuy Vu. We begin with tensions over border security. As the partial federal government shutdown stretches on, this week President Trump addressed the nation to make his case for a border wall.
This barrier is absolutely critical to border security. It's also what our professionals at the border want and need. This is just common sense.
The next day, he abruptly ended a meeting with House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, who have refused to provide billions in funding for the wall in exchange for ending the government shutdown. President Trump has threatened to declare a national emergency to get the military to build the wall. That would likely spark a legal crisis. Meanwhile, in California, newly sworn-in Governor Gavin Newsom unveiled a budget totaling $209 billion yesterday. Among the funding proposals, more than $1 billion to spur affordable housing construction, nearly $2 billion for early childhood education, and an additional $105 million to fight and prevent wildfires. Joining me now to discuss this are KQED Senior Editor of Politics and Government, Scott Schaefer, San Francisco Chronicle Senior Political Writer, Joe Garofoli, and GOP political consultant, Sean Walsh. Nice to have all of you back.
Great to be here.
Well, let's start with Governor Newsom and his new budget proposal. Scott, what does it tell you about where he's going to focus most of his energy?
Well, interestingly and luckily for him, he's got a $21.4 billion surplus. Always nice to have some money to play with. Surprisingly, he's putting $13 billion plus of that into paying down the debt, rainy day fund. I think a lot of people expected he was going to go on a spending spree, and he is certainly spending some money, but he's focusing on the things he talked about during the campaign: child care, early childhood education, family parental leave, increasing the earned income tax credit for working families. So I think he's really focusing on families, kids, students, maybe a second year of community college for free, that kind of thing.
And Joe, there are some powerful groups that backed him during his campaign. For example, the California Nurses Union, on issues he campaigned, such as universal health care. How are they and other groups that he appealed to responding to this new budget?
Well, they're very supportive. And one of the more surprising things I found yesterday at the budget rollout was it was hard to find a Republican to bash him. Usually that's the easiest thing, is say, what do you think of the opposing party's plan? They say, oh, that was horrible. But there was like some sort of baseline respect for it because he socked a lot of money away for a rainy day fund. But Newsom it's like he's creating a nation state of California right here. It's the feds won't cover undocumented immigrants. California will. We'll help you out with furloughed workers. Yeah. We're going to have our own Surgeon General. I mean, if Washington isn't going to get it done, then California will, because it's flush with money now.
Well, and that's sort of his response to Trump, isn't it?
Well, first, it's hard to find Republicans.
That's what I was going to say.
Let alone.
It was an investigative reporting project.
Served it up there, Joe. Yeah. So that's number one. Number two, I think people were pleasantly surprised that he didn't go all in on a single-payer health care proposal now.
Yeah. Well, I don't think he could. How would he pay for it?
Well, I'm not sure if you think long-term how he's going to pay for some of the stuff he's already done. Jerry Brown, when he was going out the door, actually put a little over $4 billion into baseline budget spending for increased salaries for state workers. A lot of these issues, they were campaign pledges, and it's great when you got billions of dollars to hit those campaign pledges early, but depending on how you roll these health care issues out, they are ongoing budgetary issues that can cost. So if you spend one-time money on roads or bridges, et cetera, that's one thing. But when the economy does eventually flip, if you have ongoing spending and if you unionize these daycare workers, then you've got very expensive ongoing costs.
Governors are tempted to do that all the time. You remember when you worked for Pete Wilson, they reduced class size down to 20 or fewer, and then of course the recession hits and now it's up to 25, 30. So it's hard to resist that money when it's just sitting there and when the legislature is willing to go along with it.
And certainly he came out swinging, too, on the issue of health care, right? One of the more controversial aspects of what he's proposing is that he wants to give full access to Medi-Cal for all undocumented immigrants up to age 26. And already there's criticism on that from Republicans on the national front.
Well, look, you have, so some of the health care, he wants to actually go back to the mandate in California. In the mandate, you've got 70% of the people who will be paying into this mandate helping to subsidize putting wealthier people onto the state Medi-Cal rolls, number one. And number two, should you tell people who are in the state, and we've got the highest poverty rates in the state, that they should be picking up the tab for people that are coming from other countries? You know, this is the welcome wagon California caravan sign. We're open for people to come across the border illegally. It sends a very clear signal. Now, granted, Democrats like it, and I think he gets some good PR out of it, but the long-term financial costs are very significant.
Well, and California also has been criticized for having pretty low, very low reimbursement rates for doctors. And so I was talking to Jay Obernolte, who's the Republican who co-chairs the Assembly Budget Committee yesterday, and he said, look, I have constituents who already get Medi-Cal, but they can't find a doctor because a lot of doctors just won't take those patients. And
Newsom is also inheriting a couple of projects from former Governor Jerry Brown. That's the Delta water tunnels and also high-speed rail. What is he going to do with those, Joe?
On high-speed rail, he said he is reviewing the program, the leadership, and he's trying to figure out, as he says, what it is and what it isn't. And I think what it isn't is a full trip from San Francisco to Los Angeles. Look for him to sort of focus on what he talked about in the campaign, which is valley to valley. Central Valley, where the cheap housing is, to Silicon Valley, where the jobs are. It's going to be a heavy lift. There's very little support. I think it's like, what is it, 28–30% support in the state for it now.
Well, for the whole thing.
For the whole thing, yeah.
I think he could sell the smaller one.
He might be able to sell that, but he still has to find funding for it.
If he does that, though, he's in violation of what the initiative was put on the ballot for, number one, and number two, he's in violation of what federal matching dollars came from. So he would actually probably have to go back to the public to accept something along those lines.
Although the ballot measure also called for, you know, getting money from the private sector and the government, none of which has materialized, right?
Let me ask you also about something else this week, and that is President Trump's tweet about threatening to cut off federal funds for relief for California's wildfires. He's once again accusing the state of poor forestry management practices. How has the governor responded, and what does it say about his relationship with President Trump? Well,
the governor responded, I think, the way Republicans responded, which was to say it was inappropriate. It was, you know, one of these 3 a.m. tweets that FEMA didn't even know about. The Republicans who represent the area up in Butte County, people like Doug LaMalfa, the Congress member, and the members of the legislature were very critical. It's not helpful. And it wasn't really true. I mean, FEMA didn't know anything about it. The people who live there were anxious because they were hearing that suddenly all these disaster funds were going to be cut off.
A majority of the forest land in California is managed by the federal government, not the state.
Exactly. So, you know, are there some things to do in terms of changing the policy with regard to management of those lands? Sure. But should the President of the United States be threatening to cut off funding, you know, at a time when people are really hurting? I think most people would say no.
Is this relationship with the president different than the relationship between Jerry Brown and President Trump?
I think they both have the same relationship, is that you kind of don't like the president in a political way, but you have to deal with him because that's where federal dollars come from. And I think Newsom is kind of, you know, throughout his first week in office and throughout the campaign, he's kind of gritted his teeth and bared it and kind of followed the same path in that way.
Well, Newsom also has an ex-wife who's dating the president's son, Donald Trump Jr., so that may be a back channel. And it is, because they do still talk.
All right, let's talk about the border wall. Since we're talking about Trump, can't talk about President Trump without talking about the border wall. He visited the border in Texas yesterday. He's now considering diverting disaster relief money, including funds allocated to help out in the aftermath of California's wildfires, to build the wall. Sean, can he do that without declaring a national emergency?
He would have to declare a national emergency. Actually, it may be a slick way to get out of this budget impasse, to be honest with you. Democrats can say he can't really do it. Someone files a lawsuit, it gets figured out in the courts. They held the line with regards to a border fence, and then they can put a budget forward. So it could be a slick way out, number one. Number two, with regards to the funding, though, I mean, California, when I was in Governor Wilson's office, we spent about $5 billion a year on services for people not legally here in the state. I assume that 25 years later, that's more than double. So what the state is putting forward, and the federal government in reimbursements for costs associated with undocumented immigrants, has to be well in excess of $10 billion So if you actually spent $5 billion to build a wall, and I don't think they can do it that cheaply, to be honest with you, but if you spent that, you'd actually get those savings back fairly quickly. I think from a policy perspective, Republicans and the president are on a good footing to have this argument about what's right and wrong, legally coming here and illegally coming here. But the tweets and the comments are just very, very difficult for the Senate and Republicans in the House to accept.
The politics of this are terrible. He'd be pulling money, federal money, from the biggest states in the union: California, Florida, and Texas. One of them's a swing state, one of them's a red state, one of them's a big blue state. So it's not good. And plus, there was a tweet that sort of captured this, the bad politics of this. It said, now Trump's slogan is, we're going to build a wall, or we're going to make people who lost their homes in a natural disaster pay for it. That's a terrible look.
I do think there are the makings of some kind of a compromise here. I mean, I think the president kind of got into this by calling it a wall, number one, and he also said that Mexico was going to pay for it. I do think that a lot of Democrats, including Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, are more than happy to talk about fencing. They've supported that in the past. There's already a lot of fencing, as well as technology, drones, those sorts of things. And if they were both willing to kind of give a little bit, they, I think, could get there. But the problem is both sides.
They've kind of both cornered themselves into a wall, right? I mean, President Trump has been talking, I'm getting that wall built no matter what. And then Pelosi, and frankly, for the Democrats, there's really no downside for them, right? To keep this out, to keep this protracted.
And he got up and left that meeting because he said, will you pay for the wall? And she said, or border security is what he said. And she said, no. I think, you know, if they're just talking about border security, it's different from talking about the wall. And I think they need to get off of that language.
The far left Democrats are pressing Pelosi, no wall, no wall. And remember, a year ago, the Democrats agreed to the wall. They agreed for $25 billion for the wall. And so,
well, if they got relief
in exchange for the Dreamers,
Dreamers,
But now that's off the table for them.
Well, so in 2006, we had the Secure Fence Act. It was supported by Pelosi, it was supported by Schumer, it was supported by Obama, it was supported by Hillary Clinton. And, you know, some guys running around college campuses giving quotes to those people then, and they think it's Trump and they dump on it. I think actually a fix would be to simply say, okay, the Secure Fence Act required a second fence. So you had a barrier in between. Say, we've already built a big part of the fence. We're going to build the second fence. We're going to use all this technology stuff. It's a compromise. You can get it done.
If he does go ahead, President Trump, if he does go ahead and declare this national emergency from a legal standpoint, Scott, can he do that? Because no other president has ever done this, to declare a national emergency, to fund a policy proposal, to bypass Congress.
Yeah, well, obviously there would be lawsuits immediately to challenge it, and that might stop it from being implemented until it makes its way through the courts. But I agree with Sean. If he were to do that, he could tell his base and Fox News, look, I'm fighting for this. This is what I did. It's going to have to be resolved in the courts. Meanwhile, let's move ahead and get a budget and
even if he never gets the border wall built, he can say, I fought the fight.
Yeah, exactly.
Who's winning in the court of public opinion, do you think, about this?
Well, opinion is firmly against the wall. Not only do, I think it was 58% of Americans oppose the wall, and 2/3 of independent voters oppose it. So when it comes down to the wall, that's firmly on the Democrat side.
It's much different when you talk about, you know, border security generally and Dreamers. I mean, Dreamers, there's much broader support for that. And I think Republicans could get a win, frankly, if they could come to some kind of a comprehensive deal that would include protection for DACA.
This White House does not articulate issues well. They do not roll them out well. They don't brief hardly ever. So the bottom line is, from a messaging perspective, you get the president's tweets, but they don't arose by any other name. So they don't lay out what a secure border could look like. They don't lay out what Israel has done with their double fence and that basically eliminated all their terrorist attacks. There's a way forward. You just have to define it differently.
All right. Sean Walsh, Joe Garofoli, and Scott Schaefer. It's always nice to have all of you.
Thank you.
Good to be here. Thank you.
As we just heard, the governor has some bold proposals to tackle a host of big and costly challenges. While he inherits a surplus of more than $20 billion, Governor Newsom still needs the approval of lawmakers to fund his priorities, such as expanding early childhood education. Joining me now is one of those lawmakers, Assemblyman Phil Ting of San Francisco. He chairs the Assembly Budget Committee. Nice to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Twee.
Well, this budget still needs to go through hearings in your committee as well as the Budget Committee on the Senate side. What is your reaction to to Governor Newsom's proposal?
Well, the initial reaction is very good. I mean, what he did was very fiscally prudent. We've been working at socking away reserves for a rainy day for a number of years, and you saw him do that, as well as paying down debts and paying down pensions. So the bulk of the money is really used for one-time expenses that are fiscally responsible. It's a good start. What we're also happy to see is a couple areas we weren't able to reach agreement with Governor Brown on, which was early education, child care, health care, as well as in the human services, social services area. We're glad to see him really make some investments in that arena.
Were there other priorities that you were hoping to see included but were left out?
Well, I think the one area which we'll probably be dealing with in May is around wildfires. There's a little bit of money in wildfires, but really we need to come up with a much larger proposal on how to fix this systemic problem that we're dealing with every summer, it feels like.
The governor is also proposing a one-time expenditure of more than $1 billion for proposals for projects that spur affordable housing. You represent San Francisco, one of the most expensive housing markets in the country. Is there other relief that you think the legislature can do other than what the governor has proposed to help the middle class buy or rent a home?
Absolutely. If you look at many of the legislation that we're doing right now, I have a piece of legislation I reintroduced to streamline the building of accessory dwelling units, otherwise known as in-law units or granny units. It's some of the fastest way that we can get housing on the streets, where people build in their backyard, or in San Francisco, they build out their first floor. We have cities, especially suburban cities, that are fighting that kind of development. We need them to stop. I've been working with Senator Wiener on getting more housing built near transit stops. That makes a lot of sense. So you're going to see the legislature continue to push very hard on cities to build more housing. We really can't.
I have to interrupt you because there is opposition, right, to the Wiener bill that you just mentioned, especially from suburban communities who don't want it legislated that they have to have a certain type of housing project or a certain number of housing units in their cities. And even though the Democrats now have a supermajority in the legislature, they are still Democrats from different types of communities. Absolutely. How much tension is there on an issue like housing? Oh,
there's absolutely a huge amount of tension. The previous proposal that Senator Wiener introduced that I co-authored was unanimously opposed by the Los Angeles City Council, which is not a suburb. The LA City Council completely opposes it. So again, there's a lot of discussion, but here's the challenge. The more jobs you create, the people have to live somewhere. And right now we're getting to the point where we don't have enough housing to match the jobs that we're creating.
And speaking of tensions, not only on housing, but perhaps other priorities as well. You have California lawmakers who have lots of things on their list. You introduced, for example, a bill just this week that would require businesses to give electronic receipts, not paper ones, unless the customer requests a printed one. And with all those different priorities and different special projects, in fact, lawmakers have introduced bills that would require spending more than what the surplus is already in this new legislative session. How much tension do you think there will be between the governor and the lawmakers?
Well, I think there's a lot of agreement. You have a Democratic supermajority, you have a Democratic governor. So from the top line issues in terms of health care, fighting for immigrants, education, early education, you have wide agreement. Now, the devil's always in the details, and every legislator wants to make their mark. So many of those bills are, frankly, aspirational bills. And those are all items that we go when we discuss from a legislative point of view in committee, and then we also talk about them from a budgetary point of view. At the end of the day, you have a budget, you only have so much money, and you have to spend within your means. And so we have bills that are aspirational, that aren't just about this year, maybe sometime in the future, but we also have a budget that we have to pass this year by June 15th.
Let's talk a little bit about Governor Newsom and his governing style. You have known him a long time. When he was the mayor of San Francisco, he appointed you 14 years ago to be the city's assessor recorder. Can you imagine? 14 years ago.
It seems like yesterday.
Yeah. What do you think are his greatest strengths?
Well, his greatest strength is people don't know that he's a real policy wonk. He loves policy, and you could tell from his budget presentation, he's been waiting for 8 years to really unveil his first budget. So he was really excited, and that's one of the things that I quickly learned when I got to know him.
But he's such a policy wonk that he can often be aloof, is what we've heard from people who have worked in government with him.
Absolutely, and I think that's really what I was going to say is the biggest change. I've noticed over the last couple years, he's really gone out of his way to meet with many of my colleagues in the Assembly, many of my colleagues in the Senate, and really build those relationships. That was one of his raps here in San Francisco, where he didn't have a very strong relationship with our Board of Supervisors. In Sacramento, it's been completely different, where he's really worked to build that relationship. In fact, I met with him to talk about our Assembly budget blueprint, which we unveiled in December, and much of that blueprint was put into his budget proposal in January. So you can see he's listening.
What would you say are his greatest weaknesses?
Well, again, I think that was what I just mentioned, which is the critique was he didn't have the best relationship with the Board of Supervisors.
But aside from that, anything else?
Well, no, I think that was really the biggest issue, because like you had mentioned, people had said that he didn't have the best relationships with folks. I think he's really learned over the last 8 years and really tried to do that much better.
All right, and he's working on that. And meantime, you have a lot of work to get to on the budget, because there will be hearings, and the legislature has until mid-June to approve it. Phil Ting, Assemblyman of San Francisco, thank you.
Thanks for having me.
We turn now to a forgotten Chinese exodus brought to life by a Bay Area author. Helen Zia is a longtime activist on human rights and LGBTQ issues. She's also a former executive editor of the feminist publication Miss Magazine. Zia's new book, Last Boat Out of Shanghai, is about the massive migration of Chinese who escaped China's communist revolution and what they share with today's refugees. Helen Zia joins me now in the studio, and it's good to have you here, Helen.
Hi, thanks for having me here, Twee.
Well, your book is framed around 4 exiles whose stories represent the experience of those who fled Mao's communist revolution. Can you take us back to 1949? What was the scene like when the People's Liberation Army marched into Shanghai?
Well, this is a generation that lived through starting World War II, the occupation by Japan. It had been a very brutal time, the collapse of the old regime. And so this was a society in chaos, and had been for a very long time. And so when it was very clear that the Red Army of Chairman Mao was going to be marching into Shanghai, really all hell broke loose. And it had been building for some time, because it was clear that the society was going to collapse.
And Shanghai was viewed as a capitalist place. A lot of the more elite Chinese lived in Shanghai, and they all feared persecution.
Many did. It was a city like New York City. It was one of the top 5 cities in population in the whole world, and it was China's largest and most cosmopolitan.
The Pearl of the Orient.
Right. Yeah. So at the time that the Red Army was approaching, people were so afraid that they were holding on to the sides of trains and climbing on the roofs, going, packed like sardines, or on boats that were so heavy they were sinking. And panic had broken loose. And that's why I called it the last boat out of Shanghai, because everybody who fled thought that they were on the very last boat, the very last train or last plane.
You spent 12 years working on this book, did more than 100 interviews. Why was it so important for you to tell this story?
Well, for me, it was a story. I grew up with a family. My mother had been part of this, and all I knew about her life at this time was that she was on the last boat. And when I would ask her about that as a child, she would always say, that was wartime. It was a bad memory. I don't want to talk about it. And it wasn't until I was, till she was in her 70s, that finally I said one day, Mom, it's too bad you don't remember anything. She says, no, I remember everything. And if you want to know, I'll tell you. Well, that was when her story became very clear to me. And then I began to realize that every family who left at this time said that they were on the last boat. Friends of mine would say, oh yeah, my father was on the last boat. And I realized that, like me, nobody had heard this story, and it wasn't that long ago that it happened. And it's a whole different slice of Asian America, of the Chinese American experience.
Yeah. And your book is coming out at a time when we're hearing a lot about the exodus of refugees from different parts of the world. What are the similarities that you see between what you've written about and what we're hearing and seeing today?
Oh, the similarities, the parallels, and the lessons to learn are huge. I mean, and that's the point of telling these stories and learning from history. I mean, first of all, one of the things that gets said about refugees of any time is that they are pouring into our borders, that it's just, they've decided on a lark to come here, like the thousands of refugees who walked 1,000 miles. But in fact, the refugees out of Shanghai, they spent years debating, should I leave? Should I stay? Would it be, how would we live? But how can we stay? What if we die leaving? What if we die staying? I mean, this was a daily debate in Shanghai for so many families every day. And I think that's what these refugees and migrants today, every one of them, before they decide to get on a rubber raft, you know, to leave Africa or to march a 1,000 miles, that's what they decide.
And what happens after they arrive in their new country? Because you make the point that the refugees are often the kinds of people you want in a country.
Oh, absolutely. And that's one of the big lies that's being said about these migrants and refugees that are trying to get in here. These are people who are risking everything for the possibility of living free, or that their children can live free and survive childhood. And so these are the kind of people who were, many were pillars of their communities. And that's why they are most at risk staying where they are. And so these are the kind of people who will be the most contributing people to our society, and we should welcome them.
You're also a longtime activist on women's issues, the former executive editor of Ms. Magazine, which was founded by Gloria Steinem. So I wanted to ask you about the Me Too movement. There's been quite a bit of backlash. Some men now saying they're afraid to mentor women, or they're afraid to be in a business meeting alone with them. What do you make of all that?
Right now we're in a society where people are being told to be afraid of everything, to be afraid of men, women, immigrants, our neighbors, anybody who's different. We should be afraid, when in fact we should be trying to value each other. We should be talking about decency. We should move the dial to say, what can we value in each other that's, that makes us all grow together? That we can be a one nation, like a movement in Oakland's Chinatown is happening right now, of immigrants saying, we are one nation, AAPI. We come together.
Islander.
Right, exactly. And that instead of demonizing each other, demonizing women, demonizing men, let's see the humanity in each other and what we can bring together as one nation stronger.
All right. Well, Helen Zia, pleasure to have you here. Your new book, Last Boat Out of Shanghai, comes out January 22nd. Thank you.
Thank you, Twee.
And that will do it for us. As always, you can find more of our coverage at kqed.org/newsroom. I'm Twee Boo. Thank you for joining us.